Are you a good person? In 1961, a Yale psychologist ran an experiment. Ordinary people, teachers, factory workers, and accountants all walked into a room, sat down at a machine, and were told to press a button. The button delivered an electric shock to a stranger in the next room. Every time the stranger got a question wrong, they pressed it again, and again, and again. 65% of them went all the way to the maximum voltage, a shock many believed could seriously injure or even kill a person. And when they were asked why, they all said the same thing. I was just following instructions. Let's take things back to August 1961. 3 months earlier, Adolf Eichmann had gone on trial in Jerusalem. Eichmann was one of the chief architects of the Holocaust. He organized the transportation of millions of Jewish people to concentration camps across Europe. In the courtroom, his defense, repeated over and over, was simple. I was following orders. The world watched and asked the obvious question. How does a normal person do something like that? Is it something broken inside them, some specific type of evil that only certain people carry, or is it something else? Stanley Milgram, a 28-year-old psychologist at Yale, decided to find out. He placed an ad in a local New Haven newspaper. He wanted volunteers for a study on memory and learning. Participants would be paid $4 for their time, around $40 today. Regular people came from everywhere and participated. None of them had any idea what they were actually walking into. When a volunteer arrived, they met another participant in the waiting room. Each of them drew slips of paper to decide who would play the teacher and who would play the learner. The thing is, the whole thing was rigged. Both slips said teacher. The other person was always an actor. After their roles were assigned, they went into the next room and the learner was strapped into a chair. Electrodes were then attached to his wrist. Meanwhile, the teacher watched this happen. Then, the teacher was taken to a separate room and seated in front of a machine with a bunch of switches. The first was labeled slight shock, 15 volts. Each switch went up in 15-volt increments, all the way up to 450. The teacher's job was to read out word pairs, and the learner would try to remember them. However, every wrong answer meant a shock, and every subsequent wrong answer led to a stronger shock. The experiment begins. 15 volts, the learner gets it wrong. 30 volts, wrong again. At 75 volts, the teacher hears something through the wall. A sound of discomfort, or a grunt maybe. Many teachers slowed down here and began showing signs of hesitation. Some look at the experimenter for guidance. Please continue, is what he would tell them. At 120 volts, the learner shouts that the shocks are becoming painful. At 150, the learner starts begging to be let out. The teacher stops and apprehensively looks at the experimenter once more. The experiment requires that you continue. And most people did. At 270 volts, the responses from the other room change from words to screams. At 300, the learner pounds on the wall and stops answering entirely. The experimenter tells him that no response counts as a wrong answer. Please continue, he would say once more. There weren't any real threats or mentioned consequences for stopping, yet people continued. Before Milgram ran the experiment, he asked psychiatrists to predict results. They said maybe 1% of participants would go to the maximum voltage. The kind of people who would, they said, would have to be psychopaths. The actual number was 65%. 65% of ordinary men pressed a switch they believed could kill a stranger because they were told to do it. Most participants went past 300 volts, the point where the learner had already gone silent. Milgram ran the experiment 23 different ways to understand exactly what was happening. When the teacher could see the learner sitting right in front of them, face visible and screaming, obedience dropped, yet 40% still went all the way. When the experimenter gave instructions over the phone instead of in person, obedience dropped to 20%. When other participants in the room openly refused to continue, obedience dropped sharply. Peer resistance mattered, was the conclusion. When participants were allowed to choose their own shock level, with no authority figure present, only 2.5% went to the maximum. Milgram called what he was observing the agentic state. When a person enters the agentic state, they stop seeing themselves as a moral agent making choices. They, for lack of a better term, become an instrument of someone else's will. The teacher, in their mind, is not hurling the learner. The experimenter is doing that. The teacher is just pressing buttons. Many justified it the same way history had before. They were following instructions. But, in my opinion, this isn't about evil. It's about societal structure. Every institution you exist inside, your workplace, your school, your government, is a hierarchy. And hierarchies, by design, encourage the agentic state. You're practically never asked to make moral decisions. Your job is to follow the procedure or defer to the person above you. The system isn't broken as many people think it is. No, I believe that is the system. Milgram faced intense criticism over the ethics of the experiment. Many participants were genuinely distressed by what they believed they had done. Because that's the other thing. When the debrief happened, when participants were told that the shocks weren't real, that the learner was an actor, that they had been studied, many of them didn't feel relief, they felt shame. Because somewhere in that room, during the experiment, some part of them had known something was wrong, and they'd press the switch anyway. The Milgram experiment has been replicated many times across different countries, cultures, and decades. The results vary, but the core finding remains remarkably consistent. Put an ordinary person inside the right structure, give them an authority figure and a sense that responsibility belongs to someone else, and the threshold for harm drops dramatically. You are not immune to this, and neither am I. Milgram's experiment, as I'm sure you realize by now, wasn't just about blindly electrifying people or seeing how people would react. The question he was really asking wasn't, are some people evil? It was, what are the conditions that make ordinary people do terrible things, and can those conditions be changed? And even though he knew the answer to the first question was yes, the answer to the second part, he believed, was also yes. So, whose decision is this really? The disappearance of a sense of responsibility is the most far-reaching consequence of submission to authority. Stanley Milgram, 1974.